In the 1800s, life on the streets of London was crowded, noisy, and brutally hard. This was the largest city in the world, its population soaring from 1 to over 6 million during Queen Victoria's reign alone. The streets heaved with markets and horse-drawn traffic, while a permanent haze of coal smoke hung in the air. For some, the capital of empire was a place of wealth, invention, and opportunity. For many more, it meant cramped slums, endless labor, and the daily fight to survive. This was the world of Charles Dickens, who lived and wrote in the city itself. He walked its alleys by night, drew inspiration from its people, and exposed the cruelty of workhouses, child labor, and poverty in novels like Oliver Twist and A Christmas Carol. But Victorian London was no fiction. This was a city both brutal and alive, a place where ambition and despair walked side by side, and where progress and poverty were forever entwined. A city which quickly became the beating heart of the modern world. Welcome to Animarta Historia, breathing life into historic photographs from around the world to remind us of how we used to live, where we came from, and what made us who we are today. In this episode, we are reanimating photographs of street life in Victorian London. Picture London in the late 1800s, the heart of a global empire under Queen Victoria, a metropolis pulsating with energy, grandeur, and stark contradiction. Grand palaces and soaring buildings spoke of Britain's colonial wealth, yet hidden amid the splendor was a harsh struggle for survival on London's streets. During the 19th century, London was growing fast amid a huge transformation, becoming the world's largest city and the capital of the British Empire. The population skyrocketed from just over 1 million in 1801 to 5.5 million in 1891, and 6 short years later, the population of Greater London in 1897 had reached an astounding 6.3 million. It's hard to imagine that by the 1860s, London's population was already a quarter larger than Beijing, 2/3 larger than Paris, and 5 times larger than New York City. John Thomson's Street Life in London. In 1878, Scottish photographer John Thomson published Street Life in London, years before photojournalism was even a profession. Like most pioneer photographers, Thomson rarely took photos of himself. This one was taken by accident during a street life photo shoot in China in 1871. In the smoky streets of Victorian London, Thomson emerged as a revolutionary figure in the history of photography when he turned his lens on the marginalized city folk and the harsh reality of a city overwhelmed by its growing population. Years before the social documentary photography of Lewis Hine and Jacob Riis across the Atlantic, Thomson sought to capture London's forgotten souls at a time when the poor were largely ignored and often caricatured. Along with radical journalist Adolph Smith, he embarked on an ambitious project to photograph the working class and impoverished citizens on London's city streets. The final product, Street Life in London, was issued in 12 monthly segments throughout the following year, and consisted of Thomson's powerful images accompanied by detailed accounts in Smith's essays. Unlike the common studio portraits of the era, with their formulaic static poses, Thomson's subjects were captured in more natural compositions in their own environment, allowing the viewer to truly witness the harsh realities of city life in the 1870s. Although long exposures still required the sitter to pause for the duration of the shot, the subjects still appear more at ease on their own turf, as the photographer had come to them, and not the other way around. Despite the remarkable and substantial growth of the city during the Victorian era, poverty was rampant. Families crowded into damp, one-room lodgings, while children begged in the streets. The causes were many: A booming population, waves of migrants, and low-paid factory work that barely kept hunger away. Industrial progress made the city rich, but for the working poor it meant long hours, dangerous jobs, and little reward. As London grew grander, its poorest residents sank deeper into struggle, creating a city divided by wealth and desperation. A situation exemplified by this image of a young woman with a makeshift baby carriage made from repurposed shards of wood and a box that was used to transport sugar cubes. This was Tate and Lyle sugar, produced in colonies in the Caribbean and South America, which historically relied on slave labor. Street trades and occupations. Many of Thomson's subjects were captured performing their work duties, like this water cart driver slowly making his rounds through the dusty streets. A simple but necessary trade that kept the great city moving. By dampening the roadways, he successfully kept down the clouds of dirt that otherwise choked the air. On a narrow London street, an Italian boy coaxes music from a harp as neighbors gather round. Immigrant musicians like these brought sound and color to drab courtyards, earning coins from passers-by. For some, it was unwelcome noise, but for many children, it was the first music they ever heard. While music sometimes drifted through the alleyways, other streets rang with the calls of traders. Here, a costermonger woman stands beside her horse-drawn cart, selling fruit and vegetables. These vendors were a daily sight in Victorian London, bringing produce door to door, their cries as much a part of the city's soundscape as church bells or carriage wheels. With little capital and no fixed shop, men and women turned barrows, carts, and doorways into makeshift stalls. They sold anything they could to passers-by just trying to get by. For many families, especially women with children, this kind of petty trade was not a choice but a necessity, a way to survive in a city where regular work was scarce and poverty never far away. Oysters and whelks were a cheap staple of the poor, sold from barrows and street stalls across the city. Beef and oyster pie was a Victorian favorite. A penny bought a taste of the sea, and for many, it was the only affordable protein in their diet. These shellfish sellers fed thousands every day, their trade woven into the rhythm of urban life. But street sellers didn't only sell to the poor. These gentlemen wearing top hats used the same tradesmen to buy their fish too, the only difference being that they could purchase such items without giving it a second thought. The boy selling the fish, however, well, he can't even afford the basics, like a pair of shoes. From food to clothing, the streets were lined with traders meeting the most basic needs of the poor. Second-hand shops like this one in St. Giles offered worn garments at a fraction of the price of new. For many families, these were the only clothes they could ever afford. Every apron, every coat, every child's dress had already lived another life, handed down, mended, and sold again, in a trade that clothed thousands who would never be able to afford new garments. The same applied to furniture and other household necessities. In London's poorest districts, where few could ever afford anything new, the trade in used furniture and clothing thrived. Shops like this spilled out onto the pavement, their wares stacked high, from worn chairs to scraps of cloth. This photograph was taken just after the River Thames had overflowed its banks, flooding the surrounding streets. For families living here, floods were more than an inconvenience. They ruined belongings, destroyed already fragile homes, and brought the constant threat of disease. Yet life carried on. Neighbors gathered, children watched, and mothers stood firm, carrying their little ones, as the community braced itself to endure another hardship of everyday survival. The hansom cab was the taxi of Victorian London, quick and practical for navigating crowded streets. Drivers perched high on their seats, reins in hand, waiting for passengers or exchanging words with those on the pavement. For thousands of cabmen, long days behind the horse and carriage meant a hard but steady living, a trade that carried Londoners from one end of the city to the other, until motorcabs finally replaced the clatter of hooves on cobblestones. Not all street trades carried passengers. Some, like the locksmith, sold their skill as much as their wares. At makeshift stalls on the pavement, tools and spare parts were laid out for all to see, while repairs were carried out on the spot. In a city where few could afford to replace a broken lock or hinge, men like this provided an essential service, keeping doors secure and homes intact with little more than a bench, a vice in their knowledge. Beyond the trades of the street, there were quieter crafts. Sign writers worked by hand, painting every letter with care. In a city filled with stalls and shops, their work gave voice to the traders who relied on a well-made sign to catch the passing eye. And when the paint was dry, it was men like this who carried the message. Known as boardmen, they walked the streets wearing advertisements, handing out flyers to anyone who would take one. Often uneducated and mocked for the work, it was one of the lowest paid jobs in London's street economy. Also low paid, and among the hardest and most dangerous of street trades, was the chimney sweep. Armed with brushes and rods, they cleaned the soot from London's flues. Many took on child assistants, small enough to crawl inside the narrowest shafts. It was grim, filthy work, yet for some families it was the only way to keep food on the table. On street corners across the city, bootblacks made a living polishing the shoes of passers-by. This boy was most likely unlicensed, because even the right to shine boots required an annual fee, one many could not afford. For countless children, the trade offered a few pennies a day, just enough to keep hunger at bay. Flower sellers were a familiar sight on London's streets, their baskets filled with blooms gathered from the markets. These women likely returned to the same spot every day to sell their wares, and when they died, their daughters would often take their place, continuing a trade passed down through generations. This was where the street sellers bought their flowers, Covent Garden, London's great wholesale market. Baskets were filled with blooms before dawn, then carried out through the city on shoulders and heads. From here, the trade spread into every alley and street corner, bringing a touch of color to even the poorest districts. On Clapham Common, a street photographer sets up his camera to capture a family portrait. For just a few pennies, working families could take home a keepsake once reserved for the wealthy. These open-air photographers brought the art of portraiture into reach of ordinary Londoners. John Thomson captured this image of a so-called street doctor peddling cough remedies and lozenges door to door. Many of these cures were little more than sugar and peppermint, yet they were sold with the promise of preventing illness. In an age of poor sanitation and limited access to real medicine, such patent remedies found eager customers among the working poor. Doctors weren't the only ones trying to make a penny door to door. Rag and bone men trawled the streets, calling out with a horn, buying or bartering scraps of cloth, bones, or metal. These cast-offs were sold on for reuse, fuel for an economy where nothing went to waste, and poverty made every fragment valuable. These two men are pasting posters with advertisements to the city walls. The man on the right is preparing a poster for the famous Madame Tussauds Wax Museum, which opened as far back as 1835. After hours of plastering London's walls with handbills, the bill posters paused for a well-earned break. Outside a public house, pipes and pints in hand, they enjoy the moment before returning to the endless work of covering the city in print. The VR of Queen Victoria's reign can be seen printed on the window. Here we see convicts and ticket-of-leave men, recently released prisoners, carrying papers to prove their trustworthiness. For many, places like this cheap dining hall offered not only a hot meal, but a rare chance at company and a fragile step back into society. After their release, many former convicts found themselves with few choices. A job as a dustman, collecting the ash and soot from household fires, was one of the few kinds of steady employment available. It was hard, filthy work, but for men with no other prospects, it was at least a way to earn an honest living. Smallpox outbreaks struck London repeatedly through the 19th century, but a particularly severe epidemic occurred during 1871 and 1872. When outbreaks struck, public disinfectors would be sent into the streets, armed with carts and chemicals to cleanse infected areas. Their grim work was a reminder of how fragile health could be and how vital public sanitation was becoming in a rapidly growing city. Families often relied on one another, running small workshops or managing handcarts together. Children grew up in these trades, learning the rhythms of labor early, while women balanced domestic life with the constant need to contribute to the family's income. For young men with little to lose and no steady wage, the British Army offered both employment and escape. Outside pubs and busy streets, soldiers would gather, eyeing potential recruits. The uniform promised discipline, pay, and perhaps even adventure. Though the risks were great, the lure was strong. And then there were those for whom life in a house was never an option. Traveling families set up encampments on the outskirts of London, living in wooden caravans. For them, the city was not home, but a place of trade and passing through. A reminder that London was not just a place of permanence, but also of constant movement and survival. Thanks to modern technology, we now have the capacity to colorize and reanimate a history which we have only ever seen in black and white. By bringing the past into the present in this way, we can get a glimpse of a time which preceded our own, and try to understand how it might have felt to live in that era. Photographers like John Thomson were pioneers of their day, capturing and documenting a London which no longer exists in the way it did during the 19th century. But what can we learn as we reflect on these remarkable images? Apart from the sheer curiosity which compels us to delve into our past from time to time, maybe the most important aspect we can take with us going forward is gratitude. Gratitude for the times we are living in, and gratitude for those people that suffered before we were born. For without the lessons of the past, we would still be living in slums and sending our children down chimneys and mines. We have just experienced the real street life in Victorian London, another part of our history that we should never, ever forget.